Lenin on the Production of Revolution. George Caffentzis. Quote, when this book, Restructuring and Resistance, was about to be finished, the editor proposed a title which included the word revolution. To the authors involved in anti-capitalist movements in Western Europe, some expressed very serious reservations about it and the hope that it would not be used, arguing that this word is too deeply associated with the disgraceful atrocities and despotism of communist dictatorships, or that the idea of revolutions on this continent is nothing but wishful thinking. Abramsky. End quote. Quote, it is necessary to dream, end quote. Lenin. Introduction. It is now almost a century since Lenin published What is to be Done, his first major formulation of a theory and practice of revolutionary organization. In this article, I show that Lenin, in What is to be Done, achieved an important methodological breakthrough in Marxism, the application of Marxism to itself. For up until then, the categories of Marxism were applied externally to the political superstructures of the bourgeoisie, but not to Marxist political organizations. I will then examine Lenin's concept of the, quote, network of revolution, end quote, in the early 20th century, examining its problematics and compare it with the crisis of the very concept of revolution in the contemporary anti-globalization movement as expressed by this article's first epigraph by Abramsky. Lenin's conception of revolutionary organization has been savagely criticized for decades, and the institutional results of the revolutions launched by Leninists seem to condemn it outright. On the basis of this experience, we now have a better understanding of what is not to be done. Could the anti-globalization movement in the early 21st century, the closest heir to the anti-capitalist movements of a century ago, have anything to learn from what is to be done? My answer is a very qualified yes. It is often pointed out that the title of Lenin's What is to be Done self-consciously echoes the title of Nikolai Chernyshevsky's novel. But its grammar might be more important than its genealogy. For to de la, the Russian phrase, is literally to be translated, what to do. The emphasis is on doing, not on the goal, or in another reading, on production and not the product. Lenin was concerned with the question of how one can produce a revolution in the way Marx was not. Just as there is very little reference in Marx's work on the features of a post-capitalist world, there is even less on the principles of producing revolutions. Footnote. As John Elster, conventionally points out, quote, Marx's theory of revolution must be reconstructed from scattered passages, most of which were written with an immediate political purpose, end quote. Of course, we can see all of Marx's work, from his theory of value to the general law of accumulation, as a study of revolutionary class struggle, as in Harry Cleaver. G.D.H. Cole assessed Marx's stance to revolution in the following words, quote, "After 1850, Marx had ceased to belong to the extreme left of mere émutisme." The fuck does that mean? Which he saw as presenting unnecessary opportunities to the enemy to destroy the workers' organizations and deprive them of their leadership, of their leaders by imprisonment or exile. What he wanted to do in founding the International was to take the workers' movement as it was and to build up the workers' movement's strength in the day-to-day struggle, in the belief that it could thus be led into the right courses and develop, under ideological leadership, a revolutionary outlook arising out of the experience of the struggle for partial reforms, economic and political, end quote. G.D.H. Cole. End of footnote. Marx definitely was involved in a number of important organizational efforts, but the most important one, the International Working Men's Association, was not revolutionary. In fact, he was positively hostile to the self-identified revolutionary forces in the First International, represented by Bakunin, and was brought with some hesitancy to support the Paris Commune. Could revolutions be made like other historical products? Marx was not convinced of this, and that was one of the major reasons for his infinite contempt of the revolutionary busybodies that so filled the workers' movement of his time. Lenin, for all his reverence of Marx, lived and breathed the revolution and posed the question how to do a revolution. Throughout his work, especially in What Is to Be Done, consequently, the production of revolutions for Lenin was a matter of political work. Revolutions were not just happenings. The chief categorical distinction of work for Marxists in his period was between unskilled and skilled work, and he applied it quite self-consciously. Footnote. Remarkably, Marx gave very little theoretical consideration in Capital to the role of chattel slavery and all its close relations in the development of capitalism. He was much more concerned with the internal differentiations within the waged working class, as were most other male European Marxists since 1867. For a discussion of skilled labor, artisanal labor, the quote, aristocracy of labor, and similar terms, see Hobsbawm. End of footnote. Lenin argued that one of the most important conditions for revolution production was professionalism in revolutionary producers. He had nothing but disdain for the amateurish efforts of many Russian revolutionaries. A professional is a highly skilled worker, while an amateur is one who practices skilled work on some level but does not have the full-time absorption and training of the professional. Why did one need a professional revolutionary in order to produce a revolution? Why were both amateurs and the unskilled not enough? Why could the workers, in carrying on their everyday struggles, not eventually wear away the gains of capital and expropriate the expropriators, as Marx seems to suggest in the stirring finale of Capital? The question lies in the working conditions of revolutionaries. Lenin introduced the issue of professionalism in his critique of a comrade, Martinov's, quote, lofty contempt for the struggle against the police, end quote. Footnote. Just a citation. End of footnote. For Lenin, the entrance of the political police into the struggle is the necessary condition for the professional revolutionary. Quote, average people of the masses are capable of displaying enormous energy and self-sacrifice in strikes and street battles with the police and the troops, and are capable, in fact, are alone capable of determining the outcome of our entire movement. But the struggle against the political police requires special qualities. It requires professional revolutionaries. End quote. Lenin. What is the work that the political police do? They keep the struggle secret and the strugglers confused. Here is Lenin's argument. Quote, it is impossible for a strike to remain a secret to those participating in it, to those immediately associated with the strike. But it may, and in the majority of cases does, remain a secret to the masses of the Russian workers, because the government takes care to cut all communication with the strikers to prevent all news of strikes from spreading. Here indeed is where a special, quote, struggle against the political police, end quote, is required. A struggle that can never be conducted actively by such large masses as take part in strikes. This struggle must be organized according to the, quote, all the rules of the art, end quote, by people who are professionally engaged in revolutionary activity, end quote. The political police, that was Lenin, obviously. The political police aim to have the masses not know themselves and their actions. The police have a perverse epistemological function. They are professional scientists of ignorance and disruptors of communication. Only equally professional revolutionaries could counter the police by generating intra-class knowledge and communication, according to Lenin. The inverse relationship between professional revolutionaries and political policemen in Russia, deployed by the infamous Akhranas, was recognized by police executives. General Trepov, head of the National Police and target of Vera Zasulich's bullet, concluded in 1898 that, quote, the police are obliged to be interested in the same things as the revolutionary, end quote. V's revolution. How do you say that? V-I-Z. V's revolution. If I'm saying that wrong, forgive me. The history of political policing in Russia is a complex story, but just a little sketch might be of use to make it clear what Lenin's professional revolutionaries were up against. The original version of the formalized political police, the, quote, third development, end quote, was formed in a response to the Decemberist revolt of 1825. But by the last quarter of the 19th century, it had changed its name to the Akhrana and was turning its attention to the explosion of terrorist assassins and working-class trade union organizing. The Akhrana was a secret detachment. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. Akhrana. O-K-H-R-A-N-A. It was a secret detachment of the Department of Police which used the corps of gendarmes as its strong arm. It was not a small operation. The gendarmes numbered 13,000 in the 1870s, but in the first decade of the 20th century had increased to 50,000, and at its peak, the Akhrana had 26 branches in various Russian cities and abroad. At first, these branches were controlled by local officials, After 1898, however, they were coordinated through the, quote, special section, end quote, of the Department of Police, giving rise to the specter of a, quote, all-Russian Akhrana, end quote. The long story of arrest, torture, and exile of radicals and revolutionaries followed in the wake of the Akhranas, which, however, learned much from this continual inverse interaction with revolutionaries and often put this knowledge into practice. As General Trepov observed, in fact, at the very moment Lenin was composing What is to be Done, the Akhrana was running its most sophisticated experiment in class warfare, simulation and confusion. It was creating its own trade union movement. This bold plan was the product of a revolutionary who flipped to become the head of the Moscow Akhrana, Sergei Zubetov. In March 1901, Sergei Zubetov initiated a self-help society among the city's mechanical workers. The effort was so successful that soon textile workers, confectioners, tobacco workers, perfumers, and button workers joined the society that was equipped and funded by the Akhrana. In April 1902, a month after the publication of What is to be Done, the police director Zvoliansky wrote to the Minister of Interior Plev, I don't know, quote, in spite of the seeming spontaneity of this development, the organization of a trade union workers' movement in Moscow was conducted all along in accordance with a well-thought-out plan. It was necessary to foresee every detail and direct every step of the workers who initiated it. The Akhrana's involvement was quite well known, and soon it began to be called the Zubetov movement or Zubetov's China. Footnote. The denouement of Zubetov's China is a cautionary tale to those postmodernists who believe that the state or the media or capital or the ruling class is capable of supporting infinite degrees of a manipulative Maya. The leaders of the Zubetov movement, in order to satisfy the most basic demands of the workers, organized a number of illegal but successful strikes in Moscow, and especially in Odessa. They were aided by the secret police, who actually freed worker agitators after they had been arrested by the gendarmes. In both places, industrialists were incensed, but in Odessa, the Zubetovite workers' strike helped to instigate a very destabilizing general strike in July of 1903. The Minister of the Interior, Plev, who had previously backed Zubetov, sacked him and pulled all government support from the Zubetov's China unions. A full telling of the story can be found in Judge, 1983. That's fucking crazy. Crazy. Did not know that was what this paper, that was going to be in this paper. So, learn something new every day. End of footnote. Thus, along with disruption of the communication of struggles, the political police added simulation of the movement. The production of revolution, according to Lenin, is necessarily rooted in a complementary relation between communication and secrecy. If one communicates knowledge of the actions of the masses to the masses in a channel controlled by a state determined to destroy, distort, and simulate the information transmitted through deploying political police, then the professional revolutionary must be a master of secrecy as well as communication. Indeed, the professionalism of the revolutionary is precisely defined by his/her capacity for secrecy. The organization of revolutionaries must be as private as possible in order to make the activities of the masses as public as possible. The existence of the political police, deployed by an autocratic state, having experienced a generation of terrorist activity, provided the operational test for any revolutionary strategy in turn of the century Russia, according to Lenin. Unless a proposed organizational strategy can respond to this hostile permeating presence, which operates not only through creating noise in the lateral communication channels of the working class, but also by continually breaking up bodily concentrations of revolutionary workers, its adherents are inevitably doomed, however laudatory its democratic and egalitarian aims. One should not confuse the depth of the roots of the movement with the technical and organizational question of the best method in combating the gendarmes. Lenin argued that the revolutionary movement's roots in Russia are deep enough, and even when they are unearthed, they quickly grow back. The problem is with revolutionary organizations. Once the revolutionary organizations are unearthed, they do not grow back quickly. Consequently, the key is prevention of detection, which is the job of professional revolutionaries. For, quote, in an autocratic state, the more we confine membership in such an organization, for, quote, in an autocratic state, the more we confine membership in such an organization to people who are professionally engaged in revolutionary activity and who have been professionally trained in the art of combating the political police, the more difficult will it be to unearth the organization. End quote. Lenin. In sum, then, Lenin presented a communication theory of revolutionary organization built to evade a detection state. It is no accident that the project was defending as the indispensable condition for the production of revolution was a, quote, an all-Russian newspaper, end quote. No conspiratorial scheme to storm the Winter Palace was on Lenin's agenda in 1902. He was searching for an essential precondition for a revolutionary uprising then. With an all-Russian newspaper, Lenin argues rather awkwardly for, quote, post-Fordist sensibilities. Quote, a study circle which has not yet begun to work, but which only just seeking activity could then start, not like a craftsman in an isolated little workshop, unaware of the earlier development of industry, or of the general level of production methods prevailing in industry, but as a participant in an extensive enterprise that reflects the whole general revolutionary attack on the autocracy. And the more perfect the finish of each little cogwheel, and the larger the number of detail workers engaged in the common cause, the denser will our network become, and the less will be the disorder in the ranks caused by the inevitable police breakups. End quote. The point of such a newspaper is to broaden the communication channels between revolutionary centers. Quote, at the present time, communication between towns on revolutionary business is an extreme rarity and, at all events, a rarity. End quote. This communication would create many opportunities for discussion and debate throughout the revolutionary network. This has been termed the circulation of struggles in later studies of class dynamics, which would make some kind of socialist emulation or, quote, competition possible. As he adds, quote, "We socialists do not by any means flatly reject all emulation or all, quote, competition," end quote. Lenin. Even more crucial is the intensive intra-class communication creates a simultaneity of action, which is a necessary condition for a successful uprising. Quote, "Precisely such activity, i.e. producing and distributing an all-Russian newspaper, would train all local organizations to respond simultaneously to the same political questions, incidents, and events that agitate the whole of Russia, and to react to such incidents in the most vigorous, most uniform, and most expedient answer of the entire people to the government." End quote. Lenin. The revolutionary universal is created out of the network of communicating particulars. Of course, the communication model of revolutionary production is not the only one to be found in What Is to Be Done. There are at least 4 others he develops metaphorically in varying degrees: the military, the manufacturing, the agricultural, and the construction models of production. But that Lenin's conception of revolutionary work is centered on the communicative model is indicated by the origin of, as well as the means and end of, revolutionary work he calls for. I have dealt with the means, an all-Russian newspaper, and the end, a working class in full communicative awareness of its actions, but I have kept for last the most notorious of his positions in What Is to Be Done. Quote, "There could not have been social democratic consciousness among workers. Social democratic consciousness could only have been brought to them from without," end quote. It is an uncomfortable Platonic theme that he deliberately returns to a number of times, almost enjoying the appétit le proletariat sensation he provokes. I don't know what that means. He writes, quote, "Class political consciousness can be brought to the workers only from without, that is, only from outside the economic struggle, from outside the sphere between workers and employers. We deliberately select this blunt formula. We deliberately express ourselves in this sharply simplified manner, not because we desire to indulge in paradoxes, but in order to, quote, impel the, quote, economists to undertake the tasks which they unpardonably ignore," end quote. Lenin. The revolutionary message must originate outside of the intra-working class communication network created by the professional revolutionary through the all-Russian newspaper. This is indicated both historically, according to Lenin, since the very notion of socialism, quote, grew out of the theories of the intelligentsia, and logically, since the knowledge constituting class political consciousness must be obtained in a conceptual level beyond the particularistic experience of the typical workers. Quote, "The sphere of relationships of all classes and strata to the state and the government, the sphere of the interrelations among all classes," end quote. This vital universal knowledge or theory is essential to the production of revolution, for, quote, "Without revolutionary theory, there can be no revolutionary movement," end quote. Hence, the professional revolutionary must be detached from the, quote, "sphere between workers and employers," end quote, in order to have something to communicate to the network in the first place. Otherwise, they would be simply communicating what the workers already knew more deeply and intimately than any revolutionary. The very asymmetry of the information exchange between workers and professional revolutionaries made the exchanges valuable for both sides. Lenin's model of the production of revolution was an attempt at the self-reflexive application of Marxist theory onto Marxist organizations, for it took the work of revolution making and applied it to the productive communicative models in his period when the newest organizational structures, railroad coordination, electricity production and distribution, telephone exchanges, monetary transfers, etc., required centralization and professionalism in order for there to be massification. It also recognized that, like any other productive organization, one producing revolutions needed to have a division of labor appropriate to its ends and its environment of struggle. Footnote. The reflexive application of Marxist class analysis to working class organizations that is so important in What Is to Be Done became a standard feature in many branches of Marxism in the 20th century. Lenin himself applies this method in Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism, to explain the quote, reformism of working class parties of Germany, France, and Great Britain, and their complicity in their respective ruling classes' colonial adventures. After Lenin, there have been a wide variety of individuals and schools that have attempted to apply Marxism to Marxism, from the Warwick School, the students of class composition, the theorists of wages for housework, the autonomous Marxist school, etc. For a short introduction to this method, see the Introduction to Zero Work 1. Midnight Notes, 1992. And for a bibliography that includes many of the key works in this methodological tradition until 1989, see Cleaver, Fleming, and Harold, and the bibliography in Cleaver. What is to be learned? The critique of What Is to Be Done began even before What Is to Be Done's publication in the debate that Lenin's article, quote, Where to Begin, provoked within the Russian revolutionary movement. Quote, Where to Begin, this quote that I'm saying isn't in caps, so I'm not sure. I think it says it's an article, but it's not in all caps. I don't know if that's just error or I don't know, but let me look at it a second. I don't know. I think it's an article. Lenin in 1901. Wait, hold on. Where to Begin was a sketch of the chief arguments Lenin presented a year later in his book. Okay, so yeah. Where to Begin was an article. Lenin in 1901 was immediately accused of being undemocratic, detached from the realities of working class struggle, elitist, bookish, and even a, quote, power-seeking imposter, end quote. The debate continued up until the October Revolution in Russia. Footnote. For 2 generations of Kautskyite criticism of Lenin's theory of organization, see 2 texts by Kautsky. For a view of what is to be done from the trenches, so to speak, see Akimov's scathing appraisal in A Short History of the Party, 1904 to 1905, translated and reprinted in Frankel. End of footnote. But with the triumph of the Bolshevik Revolution, what is to be done became a quasi-sacred scripture. The Third International projected what is to be done's conception of revolutionary organization as the model for Communist Party organization throughout the world. Finally, Stalin used the party to justify the post-revolutionary lineaments of the Soviet Communist Party. The Stalinist appropriation of what is to be done inevitably led to what is to be done's association with some of the darkest acts of the 20th century. Many asked, did the initial critiques of, quote, where to begin presciently pinpoint errors that would end in the gulags? These are the kinds of questions that drove the book from its sacred heights in the pit of diabolical text, especially after 1956. It is only with the end of the Cold War and its detachment from the ugly aura of state power that a new set of non-teleological readings and questions could emerge, like, does what is to be done merely prefigure the, quote, disgraceful atrocities and despotism of communist dictatorships, end quote, or can what is to be done be study, or can what is to be done study be useful in avoiding the very calamities it historically became associated with? Does what is to be done provide a good model for the production of revolutions in all environments, or is it just a historically limited discussion of the organizational difficulties faced by a Russian Revolutionary Party in the early 20th century? In this essay, I will deal with a variant of the latter question. Has the change in the nature of capitalism, roughly from the imperialism of the early 20th century to the globalization of today, made the communicative model of revolution production represented in what is to be done practically useless and a simple matter of historical interest? In order to answer it, I will deal with the question in two parts. A. Is the concept of revolution production at all relevant when confronting globalizing capital? B. If it is, then is the communicative model of revolution production useful in the struggle? If Lenin had read the contemporary epigraph of this article concerning the very word revolution, he might have instinctually responded that his own tag, quote, it is necessary to dream, and dismissed the revolution phobes as Bernsteinians bereft of even the Kantian ideal of socialism. But the mood that the epigraph describes is quite real. For the period since the dissolution of the Soviet Union has been a paradoxical one. On the one side, the process of globalization that has intensified since 1989 has brought about a recomposition and homogenization of the working class internationally that was envisioned by Marx as the precondition for anti-capitalist revolution in the Communist Manifesto. On the other side, the sense of revolutionary possibilities has been dramatically depressed. Workers of the world are uniting, physically, organizationally, and conceptually, in many new ways, with the post-Cold War collapse of the various ideological and national restrictions on motion and communication. Objectively, then, this would appear to be a revolutionary period, but subjectively it appears to be one of deep skepticism about revolution, even among the most committed anti-capitalist activists. Why? In the epigraph, we are given two alternative explanations. Either A, revolution is too deeply associated with the disgraceful atrocities and despotism of communist dictatorships, or B, that the idea of revolutions in Western Europe is nothing but wishful thinking. I question alternative A, for after all, the word revolution refers to many experiences besides the Stalinist outcome of the October Revolution. There has been the American Revolution, the Mexican Revolution, the Boxer Revolution, the Velvet Revolution, etc. Certainly, the publicists of capital have no fear in using the word from, quote, computer revolution to, quote, a revolutionary new tea kettle, end quote. Moreover, the use-neglect of a word is not merely determined by its pleasant, unpleasant associations, otherwise death and misery would be banished from the English language. This leaves us with B, the wishful thinking alternative, i.e., the word revolution does not refer to any feature of social reality. Consequently, it is pointless to use it in the title of a book describing the anti-capitalist movements in Western Europe at the beginning of the 21st century. Anti-capitalism without revolution is apparently de rigueur. It clearly has won the day. Where does this postmodern conviction come from? It is hard to be certain, of course, but there is a good explanation in the very situation created by globalization. Revolution in the Marxist tradition has always had an ambiguous status. On the one side, it standardly referred to political revolutions in nation-states, with the classic examples being the English Revolution of 1640, the French Revolution of 1789, or the Russian Revolution of 1917, or in colonies that later became independent nation-states. Example, the American Revolution of 1776, or the Cuban Revolution of 1898. On the other, it referred to social revolutions involving transitions from one mode of production to another. Example, feudalism to capitalism, capitalism to communism. The first reading of the term has precise spatio-temporal contours. The second clearly does not. Quote, when does feudalism end and capitalism begin? End quote. Quote, where does this transition happen? End quote, are different questions to answer. For example, if capitalism requires the world market to operate, then the correct answer to the where question is everywhere. There is a categorical gap between the two kinds of revolutions that makes them uneasy logical partners. Consequently, given the importance of the issue, the relation between political revolution and social revolution has been a bitterly contested one. Shamelessly and schematically, one might put the issue in the following formula. Stalinists argued for the identity of political and social revolution in the unique case of the Soviet Union. Trotskyites argued for the total difference of political and social revolutions and the need for, quote, permanent political revolutions until the attainment of social revolution throughout the planet. Maoists argued for the political revolutions in the Third World that would initiate a social revolution in the nations of the First World. Some have argued that Marx's notion of the relation was that political revolutions in the First World could initiate a social revolution in the nations of the Third. This discourse on revolution, determined by the poles of the nation-state and the world, has been undercut by the process of globalization. The most palpable sense of revolution is one involving political transformations of power in nation states or colonies. But since the sovereign status of the nation states, with the U.S. perhaps being the exception, is put into question by the process of globalization, the very notion of revolution in a nation state can put into effect or even initiate a social revolution is moot. The very idea that a political revolution led by workers in Italy alone, for example, would be able to impose even a modest program of legal reform, example, a succession from NATO, the expulsion of the U.S. military presence, the cutting off of ties to the European Union, and the shifting of trade to be predominantly with, say, North Africa, or even ending the participation in the world market tout court, the redistribution of land, the imposition of strict ecological controls on industries, etc., is definitely, quote, wishful thinking. Thus, globalization not only affects the capacity of nation-states to be controlled by their own constituents, it also affects the imposition of new political agendas that might even initiate a social revolution. One might even say that this is the hidden function of globalization in the first place, to make national revolutions politically impossible or socially fruitless. This is not to say, however, the long identified causes of social revolution have been eliminated. On the contrary, the more political revolution is emptied of reality by the process of globalization, the more pressing are the motives for a social revolution, defined as a transition to another mode of production. For capitalist development increasingly endangers the reproduction of the human race, and in this period of globalization, the pace of endangerment was intensified. In the last 150 years, the causes of this danger have been identified by at least 5 different movements. The first, Marx and the Marxist movement identified the necessity of alienation, exploitation, and economic crisis in all capitalist societies, and showed that these miseries will increase with capitalist development to sap human vitality and eventually threaten our species' being. Lenin, Luxemburg, and the anti-imperialist movement identified the necessity of increasingly violent wars over control of territory, resources, and labor power in capitalist development until the dimensions of this violence will threaten the existence of the human race. The feminist movement has pointed out the contradiction between the social reproduction needs of humanity and the operations of the capitalist market that becomes ever sharper with the, quote, progress of capitalist development. 4. The anti-racist movement has demonstrated that capitalist development requires, quote, on the immense scale of humanity, racial hatreds, slavery, exploitation, and above all, the bloodless genocide which consists in the setting aside of 15,000 millions of men and women. Five, the ecology movement has demonstrated that the climax, equilibrium state of climate, flora and fauna, as determined by the continuation of capitalist development, will be incompatible with the existence of the human race as well as most other co-evolved species. Erlich Beck has made this point well. Capitalist development, in the forms of bioengineering, nuclear power generation, species annihilation, resource depletion, and climate change, is the true revolutionary process, for it is forcing the whole biological world, with the human race included, to enter into a total experiment with unknown results that put the survival of the human race at risk. Erlich Beck writes, quote, "Consider, as an example, the tinkering advances in knowledge in genetic technology and human genetics and their impending large-scale utilization. There is no site and no subject for decision-making in this area of progress, an area that will touch, change, and quite possibly endanger the human substance of our social life. Needless to say, it will require a social revolution to halt this apocalyptical tinkering." End quote. Erlich Beck. These are far from original points. Indeed, their recognition has laid the foundation for a contemporary conception of anti-capitalism that synthesizes Marxism, anti-imperialism, feminism, anti-racism, and ecology, which is undoubtedly well known to all the contributors to Restructuring and Resistance, the book mentioned in the epigraph. Then why the revolution phobia among anti-capitalists of Western Europe and of Latin America? Perhaps it lay in the ever-increasing gap between the despair with revolutions in the nation-state level and the ever-growing recognition of the danger of continued global capitalist development. For an anti-capitalist social revolution on a global scale is realistically inarticulatable in the terms of the revolution discourse of the 20th century. We are poised between impossibilities and inevitabilities. A good prescription for silence and the lack of, quote, revolution in a title. But as the old Russians would say, quote, there is revolution and revolution, end quote. Since the need for social transformation is so widely acknowledged, the despair over political revolution is so universal, while the objective preconditions for unifying the working class laterally are being put in place by the very process of globalization. The situation calls for a new conception of revolutionary organization. This conception, however, would violate the very heart of Lenin's project. For he modeled and conditioned his notion of social revolution on a political one rooted in a nation-state. Without the nation-state, there is no apparent point to Lenin's insights. For if one were to apply Lenin's methods in what is to be done today, what would be the result? Would it not be the Sisyphean vision of a centralized organization of professional revolutionaries agitating an ocean of turbulent workers in order to seize power in their nation-state? What would be the conventional that would be the conventional default answer. Sorry, I'm lost myself. So I have to repeat that sentence. Would it not be the Sisyphean vision of a centralized organization of professional revolutionaries agitating an ocean of turbulent workers in order to seize power in their nation-state? That would be the conventional default answer. But there is another face to what is to be done. The communicative model of revolutionary organization. Lenin in 1902 rejected all the old methods of revolutionaries in the Russian past, from insurrectional conspiracy to terrorism, to put squarely at the front what appeared to be an unspectacular goal: circulating the news of struggles. You know, it's funny because that's what I read when I read What Is to Be Done. Like, I was expecting way more of like this like bleak, like off that authoritarianism, but it's like we need to be secret so we can distribute newspapers, which is I think is a little more modest than what it has been blown up to be, but that could very well be a misreading, but it seems like I'm getting a little bit of confirmation here. Now, where was I? Whether rightly or wrongly, Lenin was quite confident that the antagonistic social relation, that is capital, will provide a continual crop of struggles. He was also confident that contradictory forces motivating capitalist development will eventually explode into social revolution. Neither struggle nor revolution was problematic for him. The problem was the Akhrana, man, I should really know how to pronounce that, which was continually repressing, distorting, and simulating the good news of the struggles in order to widen the temporal gap between the field of social antagonism and its eventual collapse into a revolutionary singularity. The immediate task of revolutionary organization is to undo this repression, distortion, and simulation. Today, the scene of this activity cannot usefully be directed to the nation-state. Hence, if what is to be done is to be at all relevant, its communicative model must be directed to the planetary proletariat. For the key to understanding class struggle now is not rooted in the nation-state. Organizations that can circulate and communicate struggles worldwide are crucial for anti-capitalist politics of social transformation. As if to confirm Marx's dubious adage about humanity's propensity to ask the questions that it is ready to answer, there has arisen a worldwide set of organizations devoted to circulating and coordinating struggles against capital on a planetary basis, including 50 Years is Enough, People's Global Action, Indie Media, etc. Many of the activists and organizations of what is called the anti-globalization movement have devoted themselves to this task using the information technology now available and having to increasingly confront an international police force protecting the intellectual property regime being mandated by the World Trade Organization, the IMF, and World Bank. None of these activist coordinating organizations would consider themselves Leninist in the traditional sense, of course, but they are applying a communicatory model of revolutionary organization initially hypothesized by Lenin. Footnote. For a discussion of the organizational structure of the anti-globalization movement and the importance of the Zapatista uprising for the anti-globalization movement's development, see Midnight Notes, 2001. Hart and Negri seem to be systematically determined to ignore the planetary dimensions of the Zapatistas. They claim that, quote, the insurrection focused primarily on local concerns, problems of exclusion, and lack of representation specific to Mexican society and the Mexican state, which have long been common to the racial hierarchies throughout much of Latin America. End quote. Hart and Negri, 2000. I'm supposing that's an empire. But almost every commentator has noted the remarkable capacity of the Zapatistas to continually connect local and global struggles. Thus, in Negri's own country, Italy, one of the most important political organizations of the 1990s, Basta got its name and its political inspiration from the Zapatistas. End of footnote. Such a project has been, however, rejected by two influential commentators on Contemporary Revolutionary Politics, Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, in their recent book, Empire. They argue that, quote, the figure of an international cycle of struggles based on the communication and translation of common desires of labor in revolt seems no longer to exist. This is certainly one of the central and most urgent political paradoxes of our time. In our much celebrated age of communication, struggles have become all incommunicable, end quote. Hart and Negri, 2000. The results for this Jesus Christ. If you can't laugh at yourself. The reasons for this incommunicability, according to these students of empire, the book, Students of Empire, I guess that's Antonio Negri and Michael Hart. Jesus Christ. The reasons for this incommunicability, according to these students of empire, are that they have no common enemy and, quote, no common language of struggles that could, quote, translate the particular language of each into a cosmopolitan language, end quote. They pick out 6 powerful recent struggles. The first Intifada, the Tiananmen Square uprising of 1989, the Los Angeles Revolt of 1992, the Zapatista uprising in 1994, the December 1995 French strikes, and the 1996 general strikes in South Korea, to illustrate their claim. They claim that these struggles not only fail to communicate to other contexts, but also lack even a local communication, and thus often have a brief duration where they are born. They claim that, quote, these struggles not only fail to communicate to other contexts, but also lack even a local communication, and thus often have a brief duration where they are born burning out in a flash, end quote. But though they burn out, they have a tremendous intensity and, quote, leap vertically directly to the virtual center of empire, end quote. Empirically, their critique of the model of the circulation of struggles is questionable on many counts. For example, one could hardly call the first Intifada, which began, man, I don't know how to pronounce a lot of words, and that one's like a big one to know. Intifada, which began in 1987 as burning out in a flash. It went on for nearly 7 years, and it reignited on September 28, 2000, and is burning still. Moreover, 3 of the 6 moments of struggle they mentioned in Chiapas, France, and South Korea were already identifying the neoliberal capitalist counter-revolution as their common enemy with similar words and banners. These large-scale struggles were being tied together by the literally hundreds of general strikes, urban riots, and rural insurrections across Africa, South America, and Asia, beginning in the mid-1980s against structural adjustment programs and the institutions that were supervising them, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. A huge literature on the consequences of structural adjustment and neoliberalism had already been written and disseminated by the mid-1990s, and an internationally oriented personnel of organizers and activists could be found throughout the planet by that time as well. It would be hard to refute the evidence showing that there has been a worldwide circulation of struggles against neoliberalism, especially when the largely third world struggles led by indigenous people demanding the return of their expropriated land and the end of debt slavery, appeared on the streets of the first. For during the writing of Empire in the late 1990s, Hart and Negri must have seen images of the great anti-globalization demonstrations in Birmingham, Geneva, Cologne, and Seattle. They would probably have been solicited to be involved in the Jubilee 2000, People's Global Action, or 50 Years is Enough. These anti-globalization demonstrations and organizations spoke with a common language and struggled against the same institutions of globalization: the World Bank, the IMF, the World Trade Organization, the G8. But somehow Hart and Negri missed them or did not think they expressed struggles worthy of note. This picture of isolated, incommunicable struggles that Hart and Negri paints obviously misrepresents and even trivializes the efforts of millions of people around the planet who struggle against structural adjustment programs, often at the cost of their lives or liberty. Consequently, the conclusion they derive from such a picture concerning the nature of contemporary politics is unsupported. They argue that since the laterality of struggles, their ability to reflect and energize each other does not exist, and the, quote, only strategy available to the struggles is that of a constituent counterpower that emerges from within empire, end quote. Hart and Negri. But what is this constituent counterpower, and can the Kerala farmer, the Chiapan Zapatista, the Zimbabwean war veteran, the Indonesian Nike worker, and the Nigerian prostitute in Italy take part in it? According to our pair, none of these people will do. The appropriate figure is the, quote, social worker, in whom the various threads of immaterial labor power are being woven together, a constituent power that connects mass intellectuality and self-valorization in all the arenas of the flexible and nomadic productive social cooperation in the order of the day, end quote. This description, of course, is a bit abstract, so our pair ends their book with a prose poem on the militant social worker that identifies himself, with Saint Francis of Assisi. Quote, consider his work. To denounce the poverty of the multitude, he adopted that common condition and discovered the ontological power of a new society. Once again, in postmodernity, we find ourselves in St. Francis of Assisi's situation, posing against the misery of power the joy of being, end quote. Hart and Negri may have provided poetry, but not a refutation of the communication model of revolution production. It still is valid in the contemporary world. Not my fault there. Typo. I think A is supposed to be as. It still is as valid in the contemporary period, for it is only with the increasing simultaneity and homogenization of struggles that the divide, defer, and rule strategy of the globalizing institutions will be put into a crisis that can be followed by social transformation. This simultaneity and homogenization is not a result of a, quote, pre-established harmony. It can only be brought about by an organizational effort that will be facing increasing efforts of the Akhranas of global capital in the 21st century to repress, disrupt, and simulate the messages of the struggles. Lenin's What is to be Done is hardly a good model for anti-globalization organization in general. It is too riddled with the elitism and suspicion of democratic procedures that have been pointed out ad nauseum during the Cold War. But Lenin's insistence on the need for putting the proletarian body in touch with its members, actions, and powers, and his sober assessment of the need to have activists capable of outwitting concerted police strategy of illusion and ignorance creation, and even greater resonance today when revolution must be planetary or nothing. In these respects, Saint Lenin the Evangelist might be a more useful, if less heartwarming ancestor for the anti-globalization movement than Saint Francis the Militant.